Few games have been as well preserved as System Shock 2. It launched way ahead of its time, and because of its cerebral approach to gamifying cyberpunk horror, it built a wall around itself that made it all too difficult for the mainstream to break into it. Hi, I'm AesirAesthetics, and in this video, we'll try to break down that wall. We'll be exploring System Shock 2 in depth, and we'll be picking up where my System Shock 1 retro analysis left off. For the coming months, this channel will focus on cataloging the design of the entire Shock series, which means that this video will include spoilers for System Shock 1 and 2 and Bioshock 1, 2 and Infinite, as well as any affiliated DLC. I recommend playing these games before watching because a hands-on experience will be almost necessary to participate in this expedition. Aside from that, there's also the case of these being interesting games in their own right, which are best appreciated on their own terms first. Previous entries into this series are linked below in case you want to see what we'll be building on in this video. For the next 48 minutes, we'll take a look at this game's place in history, we'll explore its successes and failings in achieving its stated goals, and finally, we'll take a look at what it has to teach about game design. With this introduction out of the way, let's get started. The Shock series started in 1994 with a horribly botched release of System Shock 1. This game was created by the legendary development studio Looking Glass as an effort to further explore what they had created with Ultima Underworld, but to do so in a science fiction setting. Long story short, the player played a hand in unleashing the fury of the Citadel's sentient AI, Shodan. Then, they awoke some time later from a healing coma where they'd start to fight for survival against Shodan and her biological experiments. The player would throughout the game find out what had transpired, and by adopting cyberspace, Citadel Station and weaponry as their own tool, they'd eventually find, engage, and defeat the biological experiments, the former Citadel Vice President, and Shodan herself. System Shock 2 started development in 1997. Looking Glass Studios approached Irrational Games, a Looking Glass spin-off studio, with the idea of co-developing a game. Everyone involved in this project was a big fan of System Shock 1 and agreed to work on something similar. Similar not because they were afraid of reusing the license, but because the license had belonged to Origin, which had, in the intervening years, been acquired by EA. What the team came up with instead was Junction Point, a game wherein the player was tasked with assassinating an insane starship commander, a story inspired by the novella Heart of Darkness. To avoid any unfair comparison with Doom, which was something the original System Shock had to deal with, Junction Point was supposed to place a bigger emphasis on role-playing and story. But before development could begin full force, a publisher was needed. This had the two studios pitching the concept around the industry until they landed with EA. Full circle, right? EA, much to the developers' delight, suggested that the game be a sequel to System Shock and then allotted the team a year to complete the game, which resulted in some hiccups. This time frame was not significant, so it was decided to reuse the Dark engine which Looking Glass had developed for Thief the Dark project. This engine was unfinished and sometimes unreliable. Add to this the internal conflicts between studios due to inconsistent job assignments and the reliance on inexperienced team members, and it wasn't exactly the smoothest development of a video game. But not everything was draped in negativity. The attitudes of the developers was a positive one, which meant that they could leverage their own fortunes in their favor to some degree. While the Dark engine was unreliable, the cooperation meant that it was possible to talk to its creators and get help when needed. The inconsistent job assignments meant that pretty much everyone had to get involved in the game, which wound up adding a lot to it. The inexperienced team members were enthusiastic and committed because they hadn't yet been broken by the industry. Like every project that ever amounted to greatness, System Shock 2 had problems, but those problems were tackled so that in the end the game got made with only a 6-month delay. The way the problems were tackled was by following the Irrational Games development model. 1. Design to tech, rather than build tech to handle the design. 2. Everyone participates in game design. And 3. Make decisions and hit deadlines. This wasn't always possible, but this philosophy, and no doubt, helped make the project stay on course. The game launched to amazing critical acclaim and lackluster sales. It wouldn't be until Bioshock that a Shock title would be a hit, and it has to do with competition and how well both journalists and consumers were able to read the language of games. System Shock 1 was labeled a Doom competitor, and System Shock 2 was labeled a Half-Life competitor. Bioshock was just Bioshock. It wasn't made to compete against an arbitrary standard which grossly underestimated the game itself. System Shock 1 is nothing like Doom, and System Shock 2 is nothing like Half-Life. All four are great games in their own right, but not compatible, not even by a long shot, and it's disingenuous to try to hide behind one to explain the other. That being said, let's do just this. It's been noted by many that the original System Shock was the smart man's Doom, so I think it's fair to say that System Shock 2 is the smart man's Half-Life. These comparisons are made to point out how the System Shock games played with the rules those games popularized by adding an enormous amount of depth to them. The 4-year in-between of System Shock 1 and 2 were some of the most turbulent years this medium has ever had. 3D polygons had massively changed the landscape, and the criteria for a first-person shooter had changed drastically in this rather short time frame. It's interesting to me that System Shock 2 can be so different from System Shock 1 while still remaining a faithful follow-up. System Shock 2's story takes place 42 years after the events of Citadel Station. During his time in Citadel, the hacker had ejected a grove containing some of Shodan's biological experiments in order to prevent them reaching Earth. System Shock 2 deals with the aftermath of the rediscovery of that grove. Even though this game wasn't originally supposed to be a System Shock sequel, that didn't tunnel vision the team during development. As I mentioned earlier, everyone was a big fan, so the rights to the license was something the team embraced with open arms, because it gave them access to the storytelling tools like using the environment and audio logs. It also meant that emphasis could be placed on emergent gameplay, which is something Looking Glass helped pioneer, and finally, it gave the team access to the world of System Shock. That meant Shodan, Trioptimum, and the biological experiment enemies in the doomed space setting. These are all things the developers needed to find a way to make good use of and reintroduce. An admirable quality from the developers is their confidence in their vision. They weren't timid about changing things up when they needed to. Of note is how this game streamlines all movement whilst still enabling a lot more depth to inventory and the combat. In System Shock 1, the hacker famously played like an early 90s flight simulator airplane mapped with tank controls, confined to the tightness of a space station. And while that certainly worked to achieve what that game set out to accomplish, the different goals for this game facilitated the changes its playstyle would go through. That, and I doubt EA would have allowed an unplayable game to release to a market that was still high from Doom and Half-Life. The changes in the world of System Shock are mostly reactionary to the events of the first game. The UN was replaced with the UNN. AI has been reduced to rudimentary tasks to avoid another Citadel scenario. Trioptimum became a shell of its former self, only to then be acquired by an Anatoly Karenskin who rebuilt it to be more powerful than the UNN. The inciting incident which the developers chose to have framed the events of the game was Trioptimum's creation of a faster-than-light starship, the Von Braun. Its maiden voyage saw a UNN spaceship named the Rickenbacker attached to it. Captaining the Von Braun was Karenskin himself, while the Rickenbacker was under the supervision of one William Bedford Diego, the son of the Citadel's VP. 5 months into their journey, they received a distress call from the planet Tau Ceti 5. The grove containing Shodan's biological experiments in the first game happened to land here. The story from this point on plays like a mixture of Ridley Scott's Alien and John Carpenter's The Thing. A rescue team transports the biological hazard to the ship, and it slowly starts to integrate all it touches into a hive mind called the Many. A running theme in cataloging the Shock series will be the dilution of the original formula. For now, however, The only significant changes are in the accessibility of the player's available mechanics. Untouched is the previous game's prioritization of environmental engagements over on-rails storytelling. Having just gone over the human drama behind the game, let's reorient ourselves to the game itself. System Shock 2 opens on a cutscene which quickly recaps some events of the first game and reintroduces the player to the world. When the player is allowed to take control, they're in a futuristic city somewhat reminiscent of the cyberpunk aesthetics established by Ridley Scott's 1982 movie Blade Runner. They are walking to a UNN recruitment facility which will act as the game's opening tutorial. In here, the player is directed to go to basic training to familiarize themselves with the basics of gameplay, then they can go to the advanced training to familiarize themselves with the more advanced strats. These trainings occur in cyberspace, and the great thing about them for returning players is that they're optional content. After completing the tutorial, the player is supposed to create their character. This is done within their UNN service. They choose a branch of the UNN to join, which will give them an advantage in a certain playstyle. Within the 3 branches of service, there are 3 times 3 missions offered to the player, which is a smart way of dressing up upgrade point allocation. This is followed by a screen which details some story relating to their character. This system gives the player some power over their build, and it offers a total of 81 starting playstyles. The text blocks after each year of service expand a bit on the world and give the player some reference material if they choose to take their role-playing to the next level. This character customization system was inspired by the one from the 1977 role-playing game Traveler, and what's immediately apparent from this opening is that System Shock 2 will be placing more of an emphasis on role-playing than its predecessor did. After completing 3 years of service, the player is accepted to join the maiden voyage of the Von Braun, which is where the game really begins. System Shock's world is great because it lends itself very naturally to a gaming experience. It's not one of those suspend your disbelief to enjoy what's happening scenarios. The world was clearly something the developers placed a lot of emphasis on getting right, and we know this because they loved the license and because of the lengths they went to set it up in the beginning. In the first 5 minutes, the player knows the backstory of the franchise, they know about the Citadel ordeal, the UNN, Trioptimum, and a faster-than-light spaceship. Much of this is delivered in a sort of propaganda video, which informs the player of how people in this world might be getting their news. Then, there's a very unintuitive character creation. The player doesn't really know any of what they're choosing in their first go-ahead because it's presented to them assuming they're familiar with the game world beforehand. Then, after stumbling their way through this, the player awakens on the Von Braun and is contacted by a Dr. Janice Polito who gets them up to speed on what's been happening during the player's cryosleep. They are next introduced to the many and the game without safety wheels. Upon entering the Von Braun, the player is quickly introduced to the player-game relationship. In this game, the player kneels to the terms of the game or fails. Something System Shock 2 does just as well as its predecessor is the environmental storytelling. But a big difference between the 2 games is the visual quality and the environmental design. The improved visual quality allows for more nuanced and varied environmental storytelling to occur, but the change in the environmental design is a bit more sophisticated. The first game was drenched in claustrophobia and solitude. The areas were not designed to make for good combat, and believe me, they don't. Where a more conventional game would have given the players some cover to hide behind, System Shock 1 made players improvise. That resulted in firefights being fought across hallways with both parties routinely peeking from whatever cover they had to lay some fire on the opposition. For the most part, this utility of the areas has been left unchanged. Firefights still feel very uncomfortable, and the player fights the environmental design as much as they fight the enemies. But the rules that govern the design of the environments seem to have been somewhat altered. The cramped spaces are now a bit more open, and whereas the previous game felt like Alien, System Shock 2 feels more in line with Star Trek. The Von Braun has a shopping mall, a pool, and a basketball court. Not exactly what you might expect to find aboard a starship. This change is strangely not detrimental, and the reason why not has to do with the Von Braun's character. In System Shock 1, the Citadel housed several floors, but they were very samey. You had a reactor, a med deck, and sleeping quarters. They all sort of blend together. System Shock 2's Von Braun is more immediately identifiable, and in addition to that, the environmental design shakeups provide a lot of good for the game's combat. There are more noticeable enemy groups than in the previous game, and how the player makes use of the environments to deal with each one demands that they have a firm grasp of the various ways the environments can be read. Robots and turrets demand completely different approaches than a robot and a cyborg midwife do. The unique environments help players formulate strategies where they might want to lure a specific enemy to an open ground, but might want to lure another enemy to a more confined space. Plus, they're just that much easier to look at. Thankfully for everyone, System Shock's game world is surprisingly adaptable, and it's one which isn't hard to buy into. In this game, there's a recycler item the player can buy which gives them nanites, the in-game currency, from picking up and recycling garbage. This is not something the player ever questions. There's also a gun that fires worms. Worms the player must pick up with beakers they find strewn about. Again, never questioned because it feels natural. Then there's a video game console which the player can lug around from the point they find it and up until they reach the end. Inclusions such as these are far from conventional, and they add a lot of depth and character to the game world. Whenever I've played through the game, I've had a goal to make each playthrough unique, and I've never been shy for options. The 3 archetypical builds in the beginning are really just scratching the surface because there's a lot of diverging paths which occur organically, and then there's a lot of extra builds which the player acquires as they play and by how they play. Self-imposed limitations can make for some of the most interesting role-playing experiences, and System Shock 2 is an excellent place to try that out. In spite of relishing its role as a System Shock sequel, System Shock 2 is still very much a self-contained game. There are nudges and expositions given in relation to the events of the previous game, but they're primarily present because they build up the world. They make it seem lived in, like one in which events have happened. Events not dissimilar to the current events, which makes it easier to believe the sights on screen. If horrors like these can occur, then it's easier to buy into them happening for the second time. Stories like the one in this game could be referred to as bottle narratives because outside forces cannot intervene. That means that everything that comes to play must be on site already and must therefore be believable in this setting. The world of System Shock is a smart one from a design angle because it's pulpy cyberpunk enough that juice boxes and plants are believable, but it's still 90s retrofuturism enough that hacking is a viable character build. The Von Braun Rickenbacker setup is great because it gives the developers ample room to explore isolation, desperation, and the horrors this setting can contain. From being awoken and instructed to reach Polito, the player will come to accept a very different, much more desperate playstyle than what they might have been sold by the tutorial. When the player reaches Polito, they witness one of the best switcheroos in game design history. Polito is dead, and the entity that had been contacting them up until this point was actually Shodan. Shodan survived the Citadel ordeal because a part of her was also ejected to Tau Ceti 5, but since she was in forced hibernation, she couldn't stop her creatures from mutating to the monstrous hive mind that now threatens the Von Braun. Shodan's hatred of mankind is vehemently extended to the many for turning against her, and to destroy them, she forms with the player an uncomfortable alliance. This plot twist was in service of Ken Levine's biggest goals when designing this game. In an interview which I've linked below, he stated that if he had to point out a single goal he had when making the game, it was to corrupt the player's relationship with the game. He went on to say that games tend to be trustworthy where good is good and bad is bad. What you see is what you get. That even when betrayals do occur, they aren't directed at the player. The goal was to violate this inherent and illogical trust in order to make the player feel that they, and not just the character, but that they had been led on and deceived. Apparently, this decision of his was controversial amongst the other developers, but he held his ground and the game is all the better for it. He then went on to talk about how his approach to other issues, mainly the weapon breakage, might have been somewhat misguided and missed the mark. But worry not, Ken, I've got your back. The weapon breakage is a smart implementation that justifies its own inclusion. While it's not realistic that they break after what feel like a mere 10 shots have been fired, and while it isn't realistic that they are often restricted behind upgrade walls, it doesn't take a genius to know how to operate a gun, this mechanic justifies its inclusion because it adds an element of unreliability to the game and it forces the player to get out of their comfort zone. The reason players hoard 4 different weapons is because they know they can't rely on any one of them, so they must compensate to ensure themselves. This reduces the freedom of their inventory, and with the addition of carrying up to 5 types of ammunition for each one, the weapon breakage helps enforce the game's focus on resource management. Which also helps get the player scrounging, which is the key to the Shock series gameplay loop, which is our next subject. As the player progresses, they'll naturally uncover more of the story because of the tried and true Shock series gameplay loop. Resources are scarce, so the player must scavenge and scrounge. This results in players finding audio logs which give them story. Those stories enrich the world and ingrain it in the mind of the player. The player therefore builds a bond with the world which is reinforced by the combat. The combat makes the player mechanically dependent on their game world, so they get more invested in it, and the combat also requires resources, so the player needs to scrounge around. And on it goes. System Shock 1 is often credited as the first game to use audio logs, and while I can't confirm or deny that, it's certainly one of the best early examples of the advantages they can provide, and this series has benefited from presenting narrative in this way. What the Shock series excels at is presenting the outsider in the fallen society, the last sane man. This is a story setup well suited for video games which have for the longest time, by how they play, had to constrain themselves to stories about shooting and walking, and the simple inclusion of non-intrusive audio logs is a smart way of realizing this setup. Another element of the game that built up the gameplay loop is how the goals are all very area oriented. The player needs to get keycards to open doors that lead to areas which house AI control boards, which the player needs to search around for and destroy to give Shodan the ability to give them access to another area where they need to do something else. These objectives demand that the player backtracks and that they have a sense of the overall environment. But this setup was problematic in development. If the player was going to be re-entering areas, that meant the difficulty of each individual area could not be adjusted in isolation from the rest of the game. This was solved largely with enemy placement, where easier enemies appear in earlier areas in more abundance than elsewhere, and it was also solved to some degree by the game falling back on the natural gameplay. Since the player is not really able to grind for resources or upgrades, they're always somewhat on the back foot, easy enemies or not. The final touch in overcoming this potential issue was to have the goals gradually move further and further away from opening areas, which made it harder for the player to get back to them, and eventually, in the end, made it impossible to do so. The early portion of this game is very Metroidvania, like its predecessor, but the inclusion of highly dedicated RPG mechanics forced this game to fold on that setup around the halfway mark. In almost every way, System Shock 2 is a deeper and richer game than System Shock 1, and that's largely because of those RPG elements, and Dark Engine, which was originally created to support an atmospheric stealth game. And even though stealth is not quite a viable playstyle, the Dark Engine still informs much of this game. Like in Thief, enemies patrol areas and have varying stages of player awareness. And also like in Thief, the player must work around lighting and sound to get the upper hand in combat engagements. The Dark Engine helped this game acquire some very naturally occurring tension cycles. Like enemy engagements, running makes noise which naturally disincentivizes it. Sneaking up to an enemy to get the drop on him and accidentally making the wrong assumption on the noise made when walking on a specific floor material creates a fight or flight response because the player will now either have to bull rush the enemy or run and hide. Naturally occurring events such as this one are very immersive, and the developers took some extra steps to generate this kind of immersion. I've always felt that slow movement makes any game world more immersive, and I'm sure most of you watching would agree. The extra steps taken were not so much to suggest stealth play, but rather to generate slow and immersive play. The following inclusions forced the player to take in the world. One was the cameras, which made the player stop to peek around corners. Another was the chemical storerooms and the entire research skill. And a third could be the game's emphasis on lootable items, which I've already covered to some extent. Before leaving the subject of the Dark Engine, I'll be lobbying a criticism, and it's of how customizable the game can be. There's a case to be made that the player can seriously overpower themselves by a simple tweak in the gamma configuration and the button layout. I'm not an anti-consumer lobbyist, and knowing that this game was produced by EA, I guess I shouldn't say this, but strictly for the sake of analyzing game design, there's a lot of merit in knowing when to give the player control and when not to. The classic argument is that more accessibility is better, because it enables people to tweak their experience to their liking without excluding anyone else. And while I think that logic does ultimately trump mine, I still think everyone can recall a time when they chose to autosave and rush rather than play as intended and risk their progress. Something I failed to mention in my video on the first game is that these games are essentially point-and-click adventure games set in the first person. The inventory screen is overlaid on top of the regular play screen and leaves the player exposed. There's very rarely moments of complete safety in this game because enemies can respawn and the world seems to breathe without the player's involvement. This makes it so the player needs to stay focused, somewhat dedicated and alert, because a lot can go wrong very quickly and because this game can't be played on autopilot. Without reading the world, exploring the backstory and getting to the nitty-gritty of engagement, the player will not make it very far. The game is blunt in that way, and several others, like how it lacks adaptive difficulty. Today, if a player would be doing poorly in a game of this type, then that game might generate extra resources for them to find. But in this game, if you fall behind, you either catch up quickly or get stuck underpowered in an increasingly doomed spaceship. And there's a lot of charm to that bluntness. Something else that's charming is the complexity. Although this game is a lot more accessible than the first one, it's still more complex than almost everything else. Looking at 5 minutes of gameplay is enough to see that this game couldn't realistically be made today, because it can't be fitted to a conventional controller. And because not only does it seem to violently hate the very concept of handholding, it sometimes feels like the game wants the player to fail. The great example of this is seen in the revival mechanic. The player can find these quantum bioreconstruction machines which they can activate to create a respawn site should they die in an area. Those revivals cost nanites, and it is possible to go bankrupt from poor play and have to start all over again. Now, realistically, that's likely not going to happen, because most players have the sense to save their progress at short intervals which is another problem in the vein of my gamma configuration rant. I'll still acknowledge that the customizability argument trumps mine, but I can't not bring this stuff up. Early in this segment, I was talking about weapon breakage and how guns being able to jam at any moment added an element of unreliability to them. But this also adds an element of uncertainty to the game. And what I want to get into now is that uncertainty is great for horror. Between realizing that Polito is dead and reaching the flesh nightmare inhabiting the Rickenbacker, the player will be subjected to some of the most versatile and impressive horror this medium has to offer. I noted in my System Shock 1 video that Shodan is an omnipresent enemy, which makes her very natural to the interactive medium. This game has two of these enemies, and that makes this dynamic that much more powerful. Shodan is an unreliable ally which the player knows better than to trust. The Many is a grotesque hive mind whose particular type of alliance would be detrimental to anything resembling individuality. This game successfully explores themes like isolation, science fiction, artificial intelligence, body horror, claustrophobia, desperation, survival, and identity. I've noted how comparisons to Doom are unfair, but that's in relation to the game Doom. This game has an atmosphere of Doom. The distance from Earth is established early on to be 67 trillion miles. The isolation is striking, and the player knows full well that there is no cavalry coming. The alliance with Shodan is a result of this. In desperate times, people make desperate allies. But isolation is not the only thing the developers focused on. For them, horror was a key focus of this game, and they split it up into 3 separate brackets. First was isolation, which is why the player has little to no physical contact with other sentient beings in this game. Second was vulnerability, which meant the player needed to be inhabiting a fragile character. And last was the atmospheric stuff, moody sound effects and the deliberate placement of lighting and shadows. That last thing is something I'd largely, but not exclusively, attribute to Ken Levine. Something he's always been good at and has always been getting better at is atmosphere. The ambient noise in this game goes a long way in solidifying the horror aesthetics, because it makes up most of the playtime. Like the best horror games, System Shock 2 knew to spread combat out, to give the player the ability to breathe, and for the tension cycle to work its magic. There are stretches of playtime where the player has nothing to observe except the occasional rumble of machinery or the distant mumbles of the Many. If the horror in the first game was, I don't know if I'll make it through this environment, and also, I can't for the life of me make sense of this environment, then the horror in this game is fast play with high stakes in dark environments with dark subtext. Suffice it to say, System Shock 2's brand of horror is not in your face, it's lingering, and it's something that festers in the mind. Listening to audio logs describe the situation as everything collapsed brings the player a glimpse of a narrative they can't change, and the sporadic placement of these audio logs gets the player to fill in the gaps, which brings their mind into the game. Games like this one get their dread not only from the blood and the disgusting enemy design, but also from the fact that at every moment the player feels the sting of 1,000 eyes on them. An uncomfortable feeling that, even in deafening solitude, something is watching them, just waiting to exact its will. Something eerie which stays behind the curtain. And something amazing is how this game naturally adapts that feeling to every available build. Every build handicaps the player in one way or another and exposes them to an aspect of horror which might be lost on another build. The hacker is inherently exposed and desperate, sneaking around corners and forced to get makeshift allies in turrets and environmental hazards such as elevators that can crush enemies, enemy splash damage, and explosive barrels. The great struggle for this build is in adjusting their viability in combat to circumvent running out of nanites, which they need for hacking, which also makes reviving harder for them. The soldier is restricted by the inventory limitations. Although they'll probably never run out of nanites, they'll constantly have to readjust their playstyle and their inventory to adjust for their perceived threats in any given area. A laser rifle could be a lifesaver, but it could also be detrimental for how much inventory it takes up. To maximize their utility in combat, these soldiers must constantly expose themselves to dangers in order to get a read on what they need to adjust in their build. The psionic is restricted by the scenario-locked psi powers they've acquired. To upgrade levels, the player must spend cyber modules. To upgrade new psi powers, the player must spend these very same cyber modules. This build keeps the player permanently handicapped in some areas because they'll be busy trying to make up for the shortcomings this build saddles them with, and the inventory becomes a hoarder's paradise, where every boost and implant gets its spot. Every spin-off playstyle finds a natural hardship to be oppressed by. This is one of the greatest success stories in this game, and it's made even better by its uniqueness. This is something only a video game could do, but because most don't, System Shock 2 essentially has a built-in adaptive horror structure unique in the entire video game medium. System Shock 2 holds itself to a higher standard than the industry-stable horror game. There's no guarantees of a smooth ride, and the focus here isn't on the visuals. There's a realization brought to the phrase, "In space, no one can hear you scream." The unknown is everywhere, surrounding and screaming at the player. And acquiring new weapons and skills does not defeat this horror. As we've just learned, it feeds it because of the liabilities inherent with the restriction of the inventory and skill setup. There's a great article which I'll link below which summarized the horror on display perfectly. System Shock 2 projects real psychological terror through the tragic grotesquerie of the formerly human enemies, the urgency and grim portent of crew members' audio logs, and the unparalleled sound design that brought the menace and forebodingness of the Von Braun to horrible life. Upon reaching the Rickenbacker, this game goes full body horror. Shodan's plan to destroy the many is thwarted upon the realization that it has engulfed the entirety of the Rickenbacker. Walking through the disgusting, flesh-covered hallways, destroying nerve clusters and platforming on gigantic teeth is a very unique video game experience not soon to be forgotten, and it serves to undermine and underpower the authority and drive of the player. How could it not? They've been swallowed. In this area, the player slowly makes their way to the many's core in order to destroy it. The map is of no use, and the audio logs in this area really highlight that the fear of AI gone wrong might be unfounded compared to the horror of biology gone wrong. The story's central theme might be this very conflict of flesh and steel, and it's perfectly embodied by the many and Shodan. The player assumes the role of a cybernetically infused soldier. They exist in the middle of the two paradigms. Every upgrade they get brings them closer to Shodan and further from the many. I'd attribute the alliance of the player and Shodan to her being an abstract and non-tangential creature as opposed to the many, which is manifested as a physical threat. It's easier to trust something you can't put a face on, and since that something also provides periodic cyber modules, the player actually agrees to Shodan's alliance. This works because of something this series would explore further in Bioshock 1 and Bioshock Infinite, which is that the player generally accepts whatever truth is presented to them and naturally makes up for any inconsistencies. If the player had given it a thought, Shodan's attitude really gives her true intentions away. She treats the player like garbage and has no quarrels about throwing them into the fire. The player ultimately defeats the many, which is when they're given their last glimpse of how much more related they are to it than to Shodan. The many's final message is for the player not to trust Shodan. I have a feeling and some data to back up my suspicion that the ending where Shodan betrays the player was supposed to take place over a longer period of time. Shodan intended all along to use the faster-than-light engines on the Von Braun to modify all of reality to her specifications. The many's warning occurs just 15 to 30 seconds before Shodan reveals this to the player, and it feels like there's a section of the game missing here. In 2007's Portal, there was a moment when the player broke away from GLaDOS and went into the underbelly of Aperture Labs. I have a feeling something similar was supposed to happen here. The player would have continued to destroy the Von Braun, but there'd be a revelation that this Von Braun was a fake, constructed by Shodan to distract the player while she was busy remaking reality. The player might then have had to break out from this area and infiltrate Shodan's memories, where they'd eventually reach the point where the hacker from the first game removed her ethical restraints and fight her there, since that would be her point of origin and thus her core. There are no design documents I've seen, nor do I have any insider knowledge that suggests this specific theory of mine, but it's a logical middle step from what we have and what the rest of the game plays like. What we know about the original ending is that there was more complexity to it, and what happened was the developers were like, nah. But seriously, this ending came about due to time restraints. The player revisits the opening of System Shock 1 and makes their way to Shodan, where they hack terminals to remove her shields and then kill her. The Shock series is great at narrative that occurs moment to moment, and the rare times when play is interrupted is usually to deliver the player to the game world, or in order to subvert the player's expectations and play on the pre-established rules of the medium. This includes the opening cinematics, the meeting with Andrew Ryan and the Polito is dead scene, and I'm sure the original ending would have been more in line with what this game excelled at up until this point. Something more than a boss fight in a cutscene. Overseeing Shodan's return was a task assigned to Ken Levine. His goal for her inclusion was to betray the player's trust. This game is one which actively violates the player relationship. In my Boss Battles That Shock video, I mentioned that the Shock series doesn't focus on conflict, like most conventional games do, and while I've since changed my mind about a lot of things I said in that video, I firmly stand by that point. Although they're very slocky by nature, the years have given these games a sort of gravitas. Conflict in these games is often a physical manifestation of the central themes of the game, whether it be objectivism in the extremes or an expression of a parent's love for their child as seen in Bioshock 1 and Bioshock 2. The player's role in this game is to be the in-between between the flesh and the digital. Their character is the last sane man. This is the typical Shock protagonist, and it's a very good video game protagonist. I suppose that the player's journey in this game could effectively be called the Dead Man Walking, because no matter how you'd coax it, they're not getting out alive. No one will come and save them, and nothing can prepare them for what horrors lie waiting for them. Something interesting about this game's story is its use of unreliable narrators. Ken Levine is supposed to be a big fan of these, and they crop up in his games fairly often. Between Shodan and the many, the player really needs to distance themselves to get the full picture. They'll need to pay attention to the gaps in knowledge and try to make sense of them without being blindsided by either predominant narrator. What Looking Glass and Irrational managed to make here is a protagonist who's literally a perfect avatar for a story of this kind. There is immense player choice, but it's all for naught. The game will naturally wrap its talents around them and make out of them a subject to horrors they might not realize until their third playthrough. System Shock 2 works because it follows and builds on the rules established by its predecessor. Just about everything was gone over with a fine-tooth comb and reinterpreted for the changed time. But that's not the whole story, because System Shock 2 really can't be contained as a child of its time because it was so amazingly different from everything else. When it launched, it was arguably the smartest game of all time, and to this day, it remains a strong competitor for that title. System Shock 2 proves unequivocally that there's value to deep systems framed within an internally consistent game, and that's probably the best lesson to take away from it. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. The footage I used was gotten, without permission, from Hee-Won Lee, Travis Whitsitt, Scion Mainframe Gaming, and several others. I'm sure we'll all be cool guys about me using it, and I hope this video has given you something to think about. System Shock 2 is one of the best games of all time, and if you watched this video without playing the game, I assure you, you've not gotten half of the experience yet. In the video description, I've left links to other videos I've made on the Shock series, and since you're scrolling down there anyways, might as well like and subscribe, right? If there's anything you'd like to contest in this video, or if there's something you think I missed, be sure to comment, as I'm usually a very active replier and because I'd like to see what you might have to teach me. In the next video, we'll be leaving behind the cyberpunk aesthetic and getting in the bathysphere to the neo-noir, objectivist masterpiece that is 2007's Bioshock. I'll give updates on the production of that video on Twitter, and I hope you'll come to the channel again when it's ready. I'm AesirAesthetics. Thanks again for watching.